Hi, and welcome to our online lecture for KIT 301 ICT Project A. In this lecture, we'll be working through the deliverables for week 6, specifically the planning report. Before we start, let's take a minute to reflect on our first report, the initiation report, that you just submitted and would have received your feedback for. Now, if we take a look at the overall results, what we can see is some really positive outcomes from a lot of teams. A lot of teams were able to receive distinctions and high distinctions of a very high calibre for this. And this is exactly what we're hoping for and, of course, expecting in third-year students who are working with other people and pooling their resources to make sure that all of the parts of the puzzle are coming together really well. So if your team was able to achieve a result in that area, that's excellent. That's really exactly what we're hoping for. For those teams in the lower level of this graph who didn't perhaps perform so well, this is an indication that significant work needs to be put in either in terms of the way that the team is operating or the extent of work that is actually going into the initiation report. So as we move into our planning phase, if you're doing really well so far, please continue, of course, to do exactly that again. If you're struggling and you have any questions or you're not quite sure how to improve your work, please, of course, feel free to make an appointment or come and have a chat with me. It's really important that we want to give both our clients and our teams the best experience in project as possible. And putting together something that is perhaps mid-range is not the best output that you want to give a professional organisation. You want to increase your credibility and your professionalism. So this is something that we're going to spend a bit of time working towards together. So the next deliverable we're going to be working on is the planning report. And if you recall back from your KIT 203 days, the planning phase is the second phase that we go into in quite an extensive level of detail to plan for the incoming project. So what you've done so far is figure out why the project should be around and what the basic expectations of moving through the project are. But the planning report or the planning phase really goes into much more detail about specifically what you are actually going to be developing. Just as we had in our previous report, this assessment assesses all three ILOs that we discussed in our first lecture together. So you'll be required to both produce an artifact that is going to be moving your client towards the outcome of their deliverables. But similarly, you will also be providing evidence of your capacity to work as an effective team member and your capacity to undertake initiative and direct your own self-learning so that we can assure that as you go out into industry, you have the capacity to keep yourself up to speed. This is a large assignment. It contributes 30% of your overall grade, so it is quite a significant exercise that your team needs to put a reasonable amount of effort into over the next few weeks. The components are a report, a self and a peer assessment, just as they were in the first initiation report. Recall from your KIT 203 days that the planning report is aligned with the planning phase of project management, and this is where we really go into specifics with as much possibility as we can given the information we have right now and that this is an ongoing agile cycle. But what we're really looking for here is identifying what your technical artifact will actually do, what you as a team actually have to create, and what responsibilities are yours and others, and what is the time scale or the milestones by which you will work towards the completion of the artifact over the rest of the project. The specifications for this assignment are of course already available on Milo, as is the marking sheet and the associated drop boxes. So please do take a look at that to get full information on this assignment. But basically, your planning document will include three major components. The first is what we call the scope of the project. Now, you did do a preliminary scope in your initiation report. This one is much more about specific requirements and is much more detailed. For most teams who are doing business-oriented kinds of projects, it's very likely that your scope will be constituted by what we would consider to be a requirements document. Now, most of you, I think, have probably done KIT 206, where you did software design and development. It's in these kinds of units and other programming units that you would have been exposed to the concept of a requirements document. So I'd like you now to go back to that material and familiarize yourself with the kinds of things that would go in a requirements document. Basically, what we're trying to do in this document are three things. We want to collect requirements, that is, find out as much as we can about what the technological system or artifact actually has to do. So this is the task of communicating with your clients and your users to determine what the requirements actually are. It's often called requirements gathering, requirements elicitation, all of those different kinds of things. It just means the same thing. It's about getting the detail with as much accuracy as you can get right now. The second phase is what's called analyzing requirements, and this is where we look at them across different kinds of stakeholders. So we don't just ask one person, we ask people from our original stakeholder list. But because people have different perspectives, our analysis phase is looking across them to look for inconsistencies, to ensure that we have some clarity. We're not just creating one person's perspective of the system. We're actually looking across all stakeholders and figuring what they all think is important, and then negotiating a particular outcome that suits everybody as possible. The third is what's called requirements mapping or requirements modeling. And this is where we actually scope or structure out the requirements in a visual way so that we and our designers and our developers can actually start to figure out the articulation of the individual components. So this could be in terms of maps, it could be in terms of models, it could be in terms of use cases or user stories, all of those things that you've learned to do in your programming units. It's about how to articulate requirements in a way that your technical developers can actually figure out exactly what they need to code. Now that's the standard for most kinds of projects. However, we of course do have some game projects, and in those cases what we'll be looking for is, rather than a traditional requirements document, you might actually choose to include what's called a game design document. So for those students, what we'd want you to do is refer back to your Kit 107 and 209 units to figure out the components that are appropriate in terms of requiring or eliciting requirements as they are appropriate for a game. So we're looking at different kinds of levels, different kinds of mechanics, different kinds of artifacts, and how all of those are going to be represented in an appropriate way so that they can be translatable, of course, to your designers. In addition to the scoping component or this major requirements element, we are also looking for you to include a release schedule. So once you have specified your full set of requirements, what we want you to do is then break them down to what would be appropriate for the completion across 3 different agile cycles. Now we have 3 cycles, all of 6 weeks long. So one in first semester and then another 2 following in second semester. So what we want you to do is break down your scope to be appropriate to those 3 cycles. What will you do in each? How will your project progress across these 3 cycles? And the final component is what's called technical requests. Is there anything that you have identified once you've done your scoping and your release schedules that you need to request from your client to support the project? Do they have to provide any kind of technical devices or such that you actually need to create the project? This is where you document what you actually need that you don't yet have access to. So don't write everything that you've ever needed, but simply write what you need to complete components of your project. The first request will of course go to your client. The second will go to the university. Between us, hopefully, we'll be able to provide the appropriate technical infrastructure. Now finally, if you are one of those teams who didn't necessarily go great in the initiation report, this is the place where you go back and fix it. So because we are going to be coming back to some of that information in later stages of the project, we want to make sure it's actually recorded and is appropriate. So if there are some sections of your initiation report that have been identified as inappropriate or incomplete, now is the time to update them and add them to this report. As it was in our previous section or a previous phase, you will be, of course, expected to go back to previous knowledge. Now, many of you forgot to do that, and so it wasn't until we had a chat and reviewed your first draft that we identified that that was a skill that you needed to actually go back and enhance. So once again, we're expecting you to go back to your design and mapping units and your programming units and your games and fundamentals units so that you remind yourself the components that are appropriate to go into these kinds of documents. And of course, once again, all members of the team need to contribute to this component. It is not just for the designers or the programmers or the documentation people to be involved. Every member has to show an active contribution to this project because this is the most important part of scoping. The marking sheet is, as I said, available on Milo, and you can take a look at that at any stage to try and help you guide your submission. But basically what we're looking for here is, as we did in the first assignment, clear, comprehensive, and creative. That means you have clarity in all of the information you are providing in your report. It's comprehensive in so much as it is deep and detailed as is appropriate to your context. And it is communicated creatively in so much as it is not just one very long text-based document. This is where you can get creative and use maps and models and diagrams and pictures and art and anything else that is particularly relevant to best communicate the attributes of your requirements and your timelines. So please don't think that you need to throw them in at the end. Actually think about what are the major things you have to communicate and what might be the best way of communicating that particular piece of information. We want to make these documents engaging and interesting to your client so that they do actually read them and therefore they fully understand the requirement specifications that you are setting out for them. If you have any questions about the marking sheet or whether yours is meeting those particular standards, of course, it's entirely possible for you to make contact with me and show me a draft. The next assessment component that is relevant to our planning phase is, of course, our self-assessment. And just as we did last time, what we're looking for here is a detailed description of your contribution to this phase of the project. So we are looking at how long have you spent on the project across the various components of it. What kinds of things are you taking leadership in? What other kinds of things are you supporting the rest of your team in? And how are you increasing your learning so that you can practically move the project forward? Now, some of you created a very comprehensive description in your initiation self-assessment, and that was very much appreciated, because what that means is the other members of your team can remember or can better understand the things that you've been working on. If you put one line or one dot point, there's very little there that your team members can actually use to reflect on your contributions. So the more you put in these sections, the better for you. Then, of course, there is the criteria about how you think you have been working towards the project. Now, again, what we do need here is for you to describe, again in detail, an explanation of your own self-ratings. And it doesn't matter if you think there is room for improvement. That's actually a really good thing. It shows that you are self-reflecting appropriately. If you think you're super excellent at everything, particularly in areas that you've never done before, it perhaps suggests you need to reflect more deeply. So what we're looking for here, again, to help your team assess you, is to provide an appropriate level of explanation of your own ratings. Similarly, what we're going to be doing in this third section here of this template is going back to the goals that we identified in our initiation report self-review. So we're not just listing them and moving away. What we're doing now is I want you to, in detail, identify for your team what you have done to improve those areas that were either self-identified in the peer review or in fact have been identified by your team members in your peer review. So we want you to reflect on how you have gone about improving in the attributes identified for improvement in the previous phase. Please be descriptive here. What have you actually done? And then following that, again, another reflection. What are you going to do to improve based on the things that you have learned about yourself in this second phase, the planning phase. Again, detail here so that we can do an appropriate level of assessment and your team members can better understand your perspectives. Our third major component for our planning phase is the peer assessment. Now, you would have mostly all done this for our initiation report, but there are a few things I'd like to remind you about. It is an individual report, confidential between you and I. You should not and do not need to share this with other members of your team. If we look across at the template, the first line is, do you generally agree with the team member's self-assessment? So before you complete this, you have to have read all of the assessments of your team members, all of the self-assessments, and then you can define whether you agree or not. Now, it's interesting for you to identify, if you don't agree, what are the particular areas that you think they may have misrepresented or misunderstood. That is what the description of your assessment for that first section, or the second column of this template is. That is a description of your yes, mostly, or no response. Following that are very specific criteria that we want to assess your team on. And again, many of you did this in a lot of detail, which again is very much appreciated and provides great responses so that we can help your team members improve. However, many of you were fairly lazy in this process and just gave everybody perfect scores. Now, that's entirely inappropriate because firstly, it's very unlikely that everybody in your team is working at exactly the same level and is perfect at everything. What we are looking for is for you to take some responsibility to help others in your team, and you do that by helping them know where they have areas to improve. So it is unlikely, particularly in the next phase, that everybody's going to get perfect scores, but that's actually going to be okay. What that means is we're simply identifying areas that they can improve. So please be more thoughtful about both the scores you give them, identify areas that they actually do need to improve, otherwise you are not going to experience any change from them. And then finally, the last column, some of you even decided to delete this in the last template. Don't do that. This is where you must fully describe your assessments for the 10 columns above. So you don't just provide one assessment and one description. There are two parts to this, and therefore there is a requirement for 2 assessments. Please make sure you complete this template appropriately. And importantly, please make sure you submit it on time. There was a very significant number of people who missed the deadline. Given that we are trying to improve your professionalism and you are being assessed on it, submitting things late when you've had them available to you for a number of weeks is entirely inappropriate. So please make sure that you plan enough time to submit things. Once you have created a draft of your report, once again, I'm very happy to spend some time looking at it, but given our circumstance, it's likely that I will be doing so online. So if you need to see me, please make sure that you send me an email with an appropriate day that you would like to see me, and I will try to make a schedule available. Now, please remember, because there are at least 20 teams that I'm dealing with and over 120 students, I cannot continually look at the same draft of the same team. So only when your team has completed a full draft and your team has reviewed it yourself and made any edits and comments and proofreads, please then make contact with me. If you send me parts of a document, you are wasting the opportunity for the rest of the team. Please keep that in mind. So, how do we move forward? What are our next steps? Well, what I would like you to do is reflect on your initiation report. If it is of an appropriate quality, that is, you got a distinction or a high distinction, then please feel free to send a copy of this to your client. If, however, you did not achieve that, that means it is not at an appropriate standard to be given to your client. So what your team needs to do is spend a few days cleaning it up and augmenting the information. Only then please send it to your client as it is a document or a deliverable that belongs to them because they are the actual client. We want them to have the most up-to-date information. If it's not up to standard, it is not useful to them. So please take a few days to clean it up and fix it up and augment the information so that you maintain your credibility with your client and they can be comfortable with the quality of your work. Then I want you to reflect on your group and individual feedback. Are there areas in your group report that seemed to lack? Quality or quantity? So please, as a group, sit down and reflect on the feedback that you have received. If there are areas for improvement, work on strategies to actually improve. And similarly, you would have all received individual feedback on your peer and self-assessment. What are the areas that either you or your team have identified that you need to improve? You are going to be assessed not just on the work that you do, but the improvements that you make. So if something has been identified that needs work, this must be rectified, and I will be looking for that in our next set of assessment. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to make contact, but otherwise those areas are fairly self-explanatory. Please make sure you work towards improvement. The next thing I need you to do is revise your previous units. The most obvious one is probably Kit 206, which is your software design and development unit, because again, this is where you were introduced to requirements analysis, requirements trace matrices, mapping, modeling, those kinds of things. In your other coding units, there's probably other things to do with software development best practice as well. So please bring those into this as you are creating these appropriate documents. And similarly for the people that are creating games-based projects, please of course go back to Games Fundamentals and Games Design and Production, because there will be relevant components in those units that you can now directly apply. Again, we are expecting not just for you to create a general or generic kind of requirements document. It needs to be very specific and best practice. So please go back and revise that content before you start. As you are going to be working with your client again, what we're wanting you to do is develop a requirements data collection or question or tool. Now this is going to help guide you as you go through the process of collecting detailed information. This is no longer appropriate to be generic questions or open questions. These are very specific things about what the system has to do, what it has to look like, how it has to work, how it has to operate with other elements, how all of the components of the system have to work together. What are the appropriate requirements, so functional requirements and non-functional requirements, all of these kinds of things. So there's a lot of data you actually need to collect here. So sometimes it's easier before you start that process to identify very specific question sets, or in fact use a data collection tool or form to guide you. What I want you to do very quickly is set up a meeting with your client. Now, given that we are all working online now, it is going to be okay if you do not have a face-to-face meeting with your client, but you use a video chat instead, or a phone call. You still, of course, can meet them face-to-face if you choose to do so, but it's no longer a requirement given the circumstance we find ourselves in. So please set up a meeting with your client and conduct data collection in an appropriate way given our circumstance that we find ourselves in right now. Once you have done that, then your team gets together and they analyze all of the requirements across all of the stakeholders that you've talked to. Then you start to map, model, visualize, graph, represent those requirements. Then you identify the scoping in terms of, not the scoping, but the milestones or the breakup of the agile releases. And then you identify what do you actually need available to you to create those components. Now you only have a few weeks to do this. This deliverable is due in week 6. So again, please get onto this task immediately. Please work effectively in a team. If people are not working appropriately, you make contact with me immediately so that I can help improve that situation. We don't want to just hear about it in peer and self-assessment. If it is causing you concern, please make contact with me directly. And of course, I am going to be here on email and on video chat. So if you need me, if you have any questions, once you are ready with your reports or your drafts, please make contact with me and ask lots of questions. I'm very happy to help you through this process, but you need to be asking me quite specific questions. So this is where we are for moving forward into our next phase. Please take care, wash your hands, stay safe, ask me lots of questions, and I will catch up with you very shortly.